Actually, if we could zoom out on the different schools of economics.
Yeah.
Just the basics. You mentioned neoclassical. We mentioned Keynesian economics. We mentioned, what else did we mention? Well, the Chicago School of Economics.
Right.
Where does Austrian economics fit into that pile, and Marxian economics? And can we just linger and try to redefine Keynesian economics and Chicago School of Economics and neoclassical economics and Austrian economics, because there's some overlap and some tension.
Okay, so schools of economics. So we could start with classical economics. Classical economics, we could think of Adam Smith as kind of your classical economist, the founder of the discipline. Classical economics does not really use math. It's very close to political economy. It's concerned with, as Smith puts it, the wealth of nations. It's concerned to some degree with distribution. It's concerned to some degree with what makes a good political system. And what tends to really define classical economics when you're looking from a great distance is what's called the labor theory of value. So where does value come from in classical economics? It comes from the labor that a person puts into it. So maybe this in some ways comes from Locke's notion of property, that you kind of mingle, your labor with the natural world. We can say labor theory of value. So classical economics concerned with, Smith is arguing against mercantilism for more free trade, often goes by the name of political economy to show it's more capacious. It's thinking of politics and economics. You can still read these books today. The sentences are long, the words are different, but you can still follow along. So the real big transition from classical economics and political economy to economics, as it's understood today, comes with the marginal revolution. And the marginal revolution is a scientific revolution that happens in a couple different places simultaneously, right? This is one of these things that you see in the history of science, like, there'll be some breakthrough, like Darwin has a breakthrough, but like somebody else has sort of the same breakthrough at the same time, you totally, differently. So there's a version of marginalism that's continental. There's a version in the German-speaking lands, in the French-speaking lands, and in Britain, and they all kind of come together. And the shift is in the theory of value. So the theory of value in marginalism is on the margin. So say you have one apple and you want a second one, how much is going from one apple to two apple worth for you? Probably quite a bit. If you had 10 apples, maybe going to 11 apples doesn't matter that much. The marginal value is less. So what marginalism does, though, most importantly, is it opens the door to math and economics, because it means you can graph this now. You can depict this relationship graphically. And there's some really interesting work in the history of economics that shows a lot of the people who developed marginalism were looking to physics as a model. Physics, the queen of the sciences. And so they were thinking, they imported terms from the natural world to describe the social world through the lens of economics. Terms like equilibrium. So the idea being that if you looked at a market would reach equilibrium when everybody has bought and sold all that they want, or the price will settle at an equilibrium price when it's really the demand and supply are matching up.
And some of these ideas are things we would pick up at a microeconomics class?
Oh, yes. This is still out there. This is sort of the basic foundation of microeconomics, marginal analysis. And so in the German-speaking intellectual tradition, this is the root of Austrian economics. And people picking up the marginal revolution in the German-speaking lands are opposed to the historicists, who are thinking in a more evolutionary way about how societies kind of grow and change. And they have a vision of economic ideas as applying differently to different types of social arrangements. Where the marginalists, remember, are inspired by physics, and this is a set of natural laws that applies anywhere to any sort of human society. So that's his first really big fissure that we'll see again and again. Are you historically minded? Do certain traits of economic life inhere, adhere, and become expressed in certain types of societies? Or are there universal economic laws that flow through any type of society? So that's kind of a juncture, a break. And so marginalism, first, people start using really geometry to kind of graph things, but marginalism is also opening up to the possibility of calculus and the possibility of creating models. But at that point in time, late 19th century, a model is something like a physicist does. Like, think of like an inclined plane and how fast does the ball roll from one to the other. It's a physical representation of the world. And eventually, economists will start to create mathematical representations of the world. But we're not quite there yet. So we're late 19th century, and we have this fissure, we have this introduction of marginal analysis that marks the juncture from classical economics to economics. So let's say now we have economics, but we still have this fissure between historical thinking and, let's call it, natural law thinking. That's not quite right, but physical laws versus contingency. And then in the United States, this ends up mapping onto debates about capitalism. And so more historically minded economists tend to be interested in the progressive movement, and which is invested in taming and regulating industrial capitalism and changing its excesses, factory safety laws, wage laws, working conditions laws. Yet in general, American economists all use marginal analysis just in different ways. The ones who are more drawn to marginal analysis become known as neoclassical economists. They're neoclassical. The neo is because they're using marginal analysis. The classical is because they don't think we need to change the way the economy operates or the government operates. They're not progressive. Whereas the progressives are saying things like we need to use social control. The state and the people collectively and democratically need to control the way economics unfolds and make sure things are fair and equal. So that school of thought becomes known as institutional economics in the United States by the 20th century. So it's part of the progressive movement, late 19th century. Into the 20th century, it really becomes institutional economics. And it's quite dominant. And the neoclassical economists are still there, but they're very much a minority. And Frank Knight, Milton Friedman's teacher, is one of the minority neoclassical economists. And the institutionalists are much more progressive still.
Is it fair to say that the neoclassical folks and even the classical folks versus the institutional economics folks they have a disagreement about how much government intervention that should be in the economy? So neoclassical is less intervention, and then institutional economists, the progressive folks, is more intervention.
Yes, exactly right. So this is the situation in the 1920s, but the other piece I should mention is the first generation of progressive economists were very radical. They were closely allied with the socialist movement, with labor radicalism, and many of them lost their jobs at universities. This is kind of connects to the dawn of academic freedom. This is before academic freedom. And they were chastened. They became much more mainstream. By the time we get to the 1920s, we don't really have radical critiques of society coming from economists. Much smaller profession, much less important than it is today, and fairly peaceful, because the 1920s are a fairly peaceful decade in the United States. So this is a situation when the Great Depression hits. And as I mentioned before, the kind of most important institutional economist is Wesley Mitchell. And he has said, he's written a whole book on business cycles. But he doesn't see this business cycle coming, and it hits, and he doesn't have a good explanation for it. Now, perhaps the preeminent neoclassical economist was Irving Fisher. Now, Irving Fisher is big into the stock market, and Irving Fisher says sometime in late summer 1929, stocks are going ever higher and will continue to go ever higher forever. And so he loses his reputation after the stock market crash. So Milton Friedman is stepping into a field in which the greats have been discredited, and there's an enormous economic crisis all around.
And everybody's struggling to figure out why the crisis happened.
Yes. Right? And the other thing he's stepping into is a world where in the United States, there's a great deal of anger at capitalism, at the system, unemployed people on the street. In Europe, there's rising fascist movements. In Asia, there's rising fascist movements. And so everyone's very concerned about this. And Friedman is seeing a lot of this through the lens of Frank Knight, who feels like we are maybe reaching the end of what he calls liberalism. He calls himself an old-fashioned liberalism. We're reaching the end of representative democratic government because representative democratic government cannot solve these social problems. And capitalism, as it has developed, Knight is very pro-capitalist, but he says it's generating inequality, and this is putting too many strains on the system. So Knight will become one of the people who helps Friedman think, how do I develop a new theory of capitalism that works in an era of mass democracy, where people can vote and people can express at the ballot box their unhappiness with what's happening economically. So this larger movement will generate, of which F.A. Hayek is a part, Friedman is a part, and it becomes the very early stirrings of trying to think about a new sort of liberalism, which will eventually be called neoliberalism.
Okay. So if we can just linger on definitions of things. So we mentioned what neoclassical is and the institutional economics is. What's Keynesian economics? And the Chicago School of Economics, I guess, is a branch of neoclassical that's a little bit more empirical versus maybe model based. And Keynesian is very model heavy, more intervention of government.
Yes.
And so the real battle is Keynesian versus everybody else.
That is what eventually comes to pass in the United States and in the kind of overall developed profession of economics. The other piece of the puzzle here is the introduction of mathematics. And it's been around the edges, but it will pick up speed in the 1930s, like the Econometrics Society is founded. They start publishing. People start using more statistical and mathematical tools to think about economics, and they're given a boost sort of inadvertently by the rise of Keynesian economics. So Keynes is trained in the neoclassical tradition. He's an absolutely fascinating figure. He's been there in the peace negotiations at Versailles. He basically calls World War II. He's like, hey, we're going to have another war here caused by Germany because this peace treaty has been, done in such a vindictive way and people have made such bad decisions. He's there. He sees it happening. And so when the Great Depression unfolds, he basically comes up with a new theory for explaining what's going on. And the previous neoclassical understanding is sort of things go up and things go down. And when they go down, there's a natural mechanism to bring them back up. So when the economy is going down, prices are going down, wages are going down, everybody's losing money, but eventually firms are going to realize, hey, I can hire people cheap. Hey, I can buy stuff cheap. I don't have a lot of competition. Maybe I should get in the game here. And then others will start to get in, and then you regenerate prosperity in that way. And so Keynes says, sure, that's one theory, but something different is happening right now. Part of why it's happening is because we have the working class is more empowered now. They're not simply going to just take low wages and ride them down to the floor. We might not hit the floor. But also, he says, people might become too anxious to spend. They might not want to invest. And, Keynes has these discussions of animal spirits, right? He's still enough of a political economist to think not just in terms of human rationality, but what are some other things going on in human beings? And people might decide to sit on their money. They might not invest it. And so what happens then is you could get stuck in a bad equilibrium. So in the neoclassical model, the equilibrium kind of restarts and resets itself. And he says, no, we could get stuck here. We could get stuck in the Depression. And in that case, what has to happen, he says, the government stimulates investment and the government itself invests. And then he argues that, this is a student of his, Richard Kahn, says, as the government invests $1, it has like a multiplier effect. A dollar spent by the government kind of ramifies out throughout the economy. So it takes the government and puts it in the center, as opposed to, say, the banking system or the financial system, which would be the more Friedman analysis. And for many economists of Friedman's generation, and he's a weird generation because it's the generation that becomes dominant is just like 4 years older the men who become Keynesian economics. But that 4 years is really important because they come in to graduate school in economics and they get exposed to the new ideas of John Maynard Keynes. And they, I think it's Paul Samuelson calls it like it was like a South Sea virus that that attacked all of the younger economists immediately succumbed, and like no one under 50 ever got the disease, right? Because their thinking's already set. And so Keynesianism, Keynes himself is very suspicious of math and economics. And he and Friedman, it's fascinating. One of the first books by Jan Tingerman, a Dutch economist, to use math and economics, these huge volumes. Volume 1, Keynes pans it. Volume 2, Friedman pans it. So they're in the same page, but what happens is as Keynesianism arrives in the United States, Franklin Roosevelt is not really a Keynesian. He's kind of an accidental or experimental Keynesian. And there's a bunch of different ideas in the United States that are very similar to Keynesianism. They're not theorized, but they're similar ideas that the government has to do something. So this all comes together, and American economists realize that you can construct models in the Keynesian perspective. And if you can use numbers in these models, you can go to Washington, D.C. with numbers, and you seem like you have a lot more authority. And so math becomes really twinned into Keynesian economics.
So numbers are used as a kind of a symbol of expertise. We really know what the hell's going on because we have some numbers, right?
Right. And we can create a model. And so we can say, okay, in the model, the interest rate is here and taxes are here. So let's play with government spending. Right. Let's make it up. Let's make it down. And then we can get an estimation. It'll spit out, here's predicted GDP. So the other piece of the Keynesian revolution is it really gets people thinking kind of holistically about the economy as one conceptual unit. And you then have what Paul Samuelson will end up calling the neoclassical synthesis. And this is still in economics today. If you take micro, you're going to get supply and demand, scarcity, marginal analysis. If you take macro, you're going to get a very different approach. And that's more Keynesian based. And so the idea is that, and this makes sense. I mean, you can think of this from statistics, right? The way things act individually versus when they're all added together can be very different. So there's this kind of uneasy piece where economists are using kind of neoclassical tools to analyze individual behavior and individual market behavior, and they're shifting to a different paradigm when they think about the economy as a whole. And in this paradigm of the economy as a whole, the federal budget, the taxing and spending power of the federal government become paramount. And that is called the fiscal revolution. And that's really the essence of Keynesianism. But the key thing to remember is that Keynesianism and Keynes are different. And there's this famous episode where John Maynard Keynes comes to DC and he goes to dinner. And he comes back and he says to one of his friends in London, he says, "Oh yeah, it was really interesting. I was the only non-Keynesian there."
Yeah.
So
Keynesianism is more government intervention, fiscal policy. So put the government at the center of influencing the economy. And then the different flavors of whether it's Austrian economics or Chicago School of Economics is saying, no, we have to put less government intervention and trust the market more. And the formulation of that from Milton Friedman is trust the money more, the not trust, but the money supply is the thing that should be focused on.
Yes. So the Austrians and the Chicago schools see economic prosperity and growth comes from individual initiative, individual entrepreneurship, kind of private sources. The private market is what drives economic growth, not the public sector. And so for Friedman, then the question is, what is the government's role? And because he's lived through the Great Depression, he's not laissez-faire, and he won't ever be laissez-faire. Now, interestingly, Hayek, living through the Great Depression, at first is laissez-faire. And he's like, sure, like, let it rip. And things get so bad that Hayek's like, okay, that's not going to work.
Can we actually define laissez-faire? So what do we mean? Like, what's the free market? What's laissez-faire? What's the extreme version here?
So laissez-faire means leave it be in France. It's more often used as an insult than as an actual. Very few people are completely and totally laissez-faire. That would be like the pure laissez-faire would be the sort of maybe pure anarchist position, like the state does nothing or the state isn't even there. But it tends to, if I could maybe make it more precise, it would be focused on freedom of contract would be essential. And that means like the buyer of labor and the seller of labor must have absolute freedom to contract. So that means no minimum wage law, no working hours law, no employment law, things like that. That was, and this is all pre-progressive movement. A lot of things are that way, right? You know, imagine you're in 19th century America and you have a farm and you hire someone to help you on the farm. You offer the money, they take it. If they fall off a ladder and break their back, maybe you help them out, maybe you don't, right? But there's not a whole apparatus of legal liability and safety and things like that. So that would be one piece. Another piece of laissez-faire would be free trade amongst nations. So no regulation of who can invest in a nation or who can take money out of a nation. So Nippon Steel could come and invest in U.S. Steel, and there would be no grounds in which to reject that. Or you could, as a billionaire in the United States, relocate you and all your money to another country, and the United States couldn't try to keep you, and nobody else could stop you from coming in. And then in the context of economic crisis, laissez-faire would not encompass centrally provided relief. Because in the pure theory, again, very seldom applied purely, but in the pure theory, the wages need to come down far enough and people need to be desperate enough to start taking work and to start the machine again. So the theory would be if you give people relief, they might not go back to work. Now, almost nobody says that in the Great Depression because the situation is so bad and it's people are starving on the street and people feel for humanitarian and ethical reasons, it's not okay to say that. The Austrians, though, at first, Hayek and Lionel Robbins are like, this is a business cycle and it needs to run its course and it will be detrimental if we intervene. And then pretty soon, Hayek has to change his tune.
So the Austrians are the most hardcore in terms of laissez-faire.
Absolutely. And so Hayek will make the turn towards accepting more of a state and then will come to talk about how the state needs to support what he calls the competitive order. But his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, still remains very hardcore and is not really open to things like unemployment insurance or other state-based interventions.
What does von Mises say about like human suffering that's witnessed in the Great Depression, for example? Like, what are we supposed to, as economists, as humans that define policy, what are we supposed to see when people are like suffering at scale?
Yeah, I wish I knew an answer to that question. I don't know enough about von Mises and his reaction in the Great Depression. I think I would hazard that he would look more to the down the road and say, well, if you start here, you're going to go places that are bad. But I don't factually know what he said in response. I do know that Hayek's position doesn't last very long. It's not a position you can hold to. Maybe you could hold to it in other cycles. The other thing that was interesting is I found very few Americans saying this. Most who were kind of small town electeds, or the most famous is Andrew Mellon, quoted by Herbert Hoover. So not directly, we don't have him on record saying this, but apparently Hoover records in his memoirs that Mellon said something like, liquidate real estate, liquidate stocks, purge the rottenness out of the system, people will live a healthier life. And certainly there were members of the Federal Reserve who felt like it would create, they didn't say moral hazard, but it would create what we now call moral hazard, bad habits, were we to intervene and to save failing banks, because failing banks need to be taught a lesson. They need to be taught discipline. And so a lot of people, I think, saw it in the context of discipline. This is discipline. And if you remove the discipline, you'll be taking away something fundamental in society.
So Milton Friedman never quite went all the way to laissez-faire.
No, he didn't see that. And what's really interesting is the number of incredibly radical proposals that he and his teachers were floating. So I've mentioned Frank Knight. Another really important influence on Friedman was Henry Simons, who was a junior professor at Chicago. And Simons had this idea for what he called 100% money, which would be a law that says banks have to hold 100% of the deposits they receive. They can't loan them out on the margin. So this would completely and totally have overhauled the U.S. banking system. And he would have said, there's a category of things called banks where you get deposits, and then there's going to be a category of sort of, he didn't say investment banks, but investment vehicles that will invest. So similar to what did happen in some ways in the banking reforms, in that in the 1930s, the investment banks were split from the deposit banks, and the banks that took deposits were much more highly regulated, and they were supported by the FDIC. But the point being, the Chicago school had these very radical proposals for reform. Go off the gold standard, restrict the currency, change the banks, immediately relief payments now. What is important to note, though, is that they thought of all of those as emergency measures to get through the emergency, not as permanent alterations in the state of what had to be, and not permanent alterations between state and market. Where the Keynesian assumption is things have changed, times have changed, we're in a new dispensation, and we need a new relationship. So Milton Friedman is very open to doing things differently in a state of emergency. He will have different ideas during World War II than any other time. And that's why I think he would have been supportive of at least the first rounds of coronavirus relief, because I think he would have put his emergency thinking hat on. So in that way, he was definitely more flexible.